The neighbors used his pool without permission, ignoring all requests to leave him alone. But one day his patience broke, and he did something no one expected. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching us from. Freddie Hart stood at the edge of his new backyard, surveying the sparkling pool that stretched out before him. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the water, its surface reflecting the neatly trimmed hedges and the clear blue sky above. This was his sanctuary, his hard-earned retreat after years of relentless work and personal challenges. For Freddie, this wasn't just a backyard, it was the embodiment of a dream he had nurtured for years, one that he had finally turned into reality after his divorce. 3 years ago, Freddie had thrown himself into his career as a civil engineer specializing in urban infrastructure. He worked long hours, managing complex projects. The intensity of his work left little time for personal life, but that was a sacrifice he was willing to make when his promotion came through earlier that year. Freddie decided it was time to reward himself. He sold his cramped apartment in the city and moved to the suburbs, purchasing a spacious single-story house on a quiet cul-de-sac. The house had everything he had ever wanted: a modern kitchen with stainless steel appliances. Charles Lewis Marshall, the father, was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a booming voice and an easy smile. His wife Imogen exuded the kind of polished friendliness that made her seem like the perfect host for any neighborhood. Gathering, the 3 children, teenage twins and a younger daughter, hovered nearby as Louis shook Freddie's hand with a firm grip. "Welcome to the neighborhood, man," Louis said, his grin wide and confident. "You've got yourself a great spot here. That pool is going to be a hit. My kids are already jealous." Freddie led politely, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to such forwardness, but he appreciated the gesture. "Thanks, it's a nice place. Looking forward to settling in," Imogen chimed in. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. We're just next door, and we've been here for years. This is a great community. You'll love it." Freddie thanked them and excused himself, eager to get back to unpacking. The Marshalls seemed pleasant enough, but their energy was a bit overwhelming for someone who valued solitude as much as Freddie did. Still, he reminded himself that being part of a neighborhood meant some degree of interaction, and he resolved to maintain a polite but distant relationship with his new neighbors. The first few weeks in the house were everything Freddie had hoped for. He spent his evenings sitting by the pool, the soft glow of the underwater lights creating a tranquil ambiance. On weekends, he swam laps in the morning and napped in the shade of the patio in the afternoon. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. He also took note of the rhythm of the neighborhood. The Reuben across the street had their grandchildren over every Sunday, their laughter echoing through the queue. The young couple next door often jogged together in the early mornings, their baby snug in a stroller. As for the Marshalls, they were the most active presence on the street. Lewis's booming laugh could be heard during his backyard barbecues, and the sound of the twins' basketball games often carried over the fence. At first, Freddie didn't mind the Marshalls' energy stayed confined to their own yard, and while it was louder than he preferred, it didn't infringe on his peace. But one Saturday afternoon, as Freddie returned home from a run, he noticed something strange. A group of teenagers, none of whom he recognized, were splashing around in his pool. He stopped in his tracks, disbelief giving way to irritation. He had only moved in a month ago, and already someone had taken the liberty of using his property without permission. Approaching the backyard, he noticed the Marshall twins among the group, laughing and diving into the water as if they owned the place. Freddie cleared his throat loudly, and the teenagers froze their laughter. Dawn, as they turned to face him, said, "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. One of the twins, a boy with curly hair, shrugged. "We were just swimming in your pool. Awesome, by the way." "Yeah, well, it's also private property," Freddie replied. "I don't recall giving anyone permission to be here." The group mumbled apologies, quickly grabbing their towels and scampering out of the yard as they disappeared through the side gate. Freddie felt a mix of frustration and confusion. He hadn't expected this kind of boundary, pushing in a neighborhood that had seemed so respectful. That evening, he stopped by the Marshall's house to address the issue. Louis opened the door, a beer in hand, and greeted Freddie with his usual jovial demeanor. When Freddie explained what had happened, Louis nodded along, his smile never wavering. "Ah, teenagers," Louis said with a Louisle. "They don't always think things through. I'll talk to them about it. Don't worry, it won't happen again." Freddie wanted to believe him, but something about Lewis's casual attitude didn't sit right. Nevertheless, he decided to let it go for now, trusting that the conversation would be enough to set boundaries. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Freddie couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a larger problem. He had moved here for peace and privacy, but it seemed that maintaining those things might be more challenging than he had anticipated. The following weeks were a strange mix of tranquility and tension for Freddie. On the surface, life in his new neighborhood continued much as it had before the Reuben hosted their weekly family dinners. The joggers kept their early morning routines, and Freddie enjoyed peaceful evenings by the pool when he returned from work. Yet a nagging unease settled in the back of his mind, a sense that his personal space wasn't quite as inviolable as he'd hoped. The incident with the teenagers using his pool lingered like a stubborn stain on his thoughts. Lewis's dismissive attitude had struck Freddie as a red flag, while the man's easygoing charm might have seemed harmless to others. Freddie had seen enough in his lifetime to recognize the subtle signs of someone who didn't take boundaries seriously. He resolved to keep an eye on the situation, hoping that his firm stance during their initial conversation would be enough to deter further incidents, but that hope proved short-lived. One Friday evening after a particularly grueling week at work, Freddie came home to find a familiar scene playing out in his backyard. The twins were back along with a few of their friends. They were splashing and laughing, their voices carrying across the yard as if it were a public park. Freddie stopped in his tracks, his pulse quickening. This time, they had even brought snacks. Their brightly colored bags of chips and soda cans scattered across the poolside furniture. Freddie didn't bother with pleasantries. He marched into the yard, his expression stern. The group noticed him almost immediately, their laughter faltering as they registered his presence. "What's going on here?" Freddie asked, his voice calm but edged with unmistakable irritation. The twins exchanged guilty glances before one of them, a tall, lanky boy named Ethan, spoke up. "We just thought, since it's hot out, maybe you wouldn't mind." "I do mind," Freddie said firmly. He gestured toward the gate. Out now, the teenagers scrambled to gather their things, muttering half-hearted apologies as they left. Freddie stood by the pool, watching them go, his frustration mounting. This wasn't just about kids being kids. It was about respect, or the lack thereof. The pool, which had once symbolized his sanctuary, now felt like contested territory. That evening, Freddie decided to address the issue more formally. He drafted a polite but direct note, reminding the marshals that his property was private and that any further intrusions would not be tolerated. Early the next morning, he slipped the note into their mailbox and returned to his house, hoping that this would finally put an end to the problem. For a few days, it seemed like his message had been received. The twins stayed out of sight, and the pool remained undisturbed. Freddie began to relax, allowing himself to believe that the situation had been resolved. He even considered Ed introducing himself to a few more neighbors, hoping to establish friendly but respectful connections. But then came the Saturday afternoon barbecue. Freddie had spent the morning running errands, and when he returned home around midday, he was greeted by the unmistakable sound of laughter and music emanating from his backyard. His stomach sank as he parked his car and walked to the side gate. Peering through the slat, he saw a full-fledged gathering in progress. Louis, Imogen, their kids, and at least a dozen others were lounging by the pool, grilling burgers and sipping drinks as if they owned the place. Freddie's first reaction was disbelief. How could anyone think this was acceptable? He took a deep breath, steadying himself before pushing the gate open and stepping into the yard. The scene froze for a moment as everyone turned to look at him. Louis, standing by the grill with a pair of tongs in hand, greeted Freddie with a broad smile, completely unbothered. "Hey, Freddie, hope you don't mind. We thought we'd make the most of this beautiful day. Your pool's too nice not to share." Freddie clenched his jaw, choosing his words carefully. "Louis, this is my property. You can't just show up here with a crowd of people and act like it's yours." Louis laughed, the sound grating against Freddie's nerves. "Oh, come on, man, we're neighbors. No harm, no foul, right? Besides, you weren't using it. Fred Dye's patient's already wearing thin," he snapped. "That's not the point. This is my home, my space. You need to leave, all of you." The guests began to murmur uncomfortably, some exchanging awkward glances. Louis's smile faltered, but only slightly. All right, he said, raising his hands and mock surrendering. "No need to get worked up, we'll clear out." It took them another 15 minutes to actually leave, during which Freddy stood silently by the gate, arms crossed, making it clear that he wasn't budging until every last guest had gone. When the yard was finally empty, he surveyed the aftermath: scattered trash, damp towels, and a half-eaten plate of food left on one of his lamps and chairs that evening. As Freddy cleaned up the mess, he felt a heavy sense of disillusionment settle over him. He had moved here for peace, for privacy, for a chance to build a life that was truly his own. Yet barely a month in, he was already locked in a battle to defend his boundaries against neighbors who seemed to have no concept of them. As the sun set and the yard grew quiet, Freddy sat by the edge of the pool staring into its calm rippling the surface for the first time. It didn't feel like a haven. It felt like a battleground, and he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that the worst was yet to come. The days following the barbecue were quiet, but not in a way that brought Freddy any peace. The marshals seemed to take his demand to leave as a temporary setback, rather than a definitive boundary. The silence felt more like a lull before the next storm, a tense waiting period during which Freddy began to notice subtle shifts in their behavior. Louis, who had once greeted him with a jovial wave whenever they crossed paths, now offered only a tight-lipped nod. The twins avoided eye contact altogether. Even Imogen, usually bubbly and cheerful, seemed colder during chance encounters. Freddy wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or concerned. On one hand, the absence of further intrusions was a welcome change. On the other, the marshal's standoffishness hinted at something unspoken, as though they were silently regrouping for another push. Freddy's instincts told him to stay alert, and he was soon proven right. The next incident occurred on a breezy Saturday morning. Freddy had spent the first half of the day mowing his lawn and pruning the hedges around his backyard. With a glass of iced tea in hand, he sat down on his patio to enjoy the fruits of his labor. The quiet hum of the neighborhood was soothing. Birds chirping, a lawn mower rumbling in the distance, and the faint chatter of children playing somewhere nearby. For a moment, Freddy felt at ease. That moment was shattered by the sound of splashing. Freddy froze, his grip tightening on the glass. The unmistakable noise of people jumping into water came from his pool, accompanied by bursts of laughter. His stomach sank as he turned his head towards the source of the commotion. Sure enough, a group of teenagers was back, and they weren't alone. The Marshall twins had brought along more friends this time, and they were all having what appeared to be an impromptu pool party. Loud music blared from a portable speaker, perched precariously on one of Freddy's patio chairs. Freddy stood, his chest tight with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. This wasn't just a casual mistake or misunderstanding. It was blatant disregard for his property. He walked toward the pool, his shadow stretching across the water as the teenagers turned to face him. "What do you think you're doing?" Freddy demanded, his voice steady but firm. The group exchanged nervous glances before one of the twins, Ethan, spoke up. "We thought you were cool with it," he said, his tone half apologetic, half defensive. "It's just a pool, man." Freddy's patience had worn thin. "It's my pool," he said sharply, "and I've made it very clear that you're not allowed to use it without my permission. Get out now." The group hesitated for a moment, as though they were debating whether to argue, but Freddy's unwavering expression left little room for negotiation. Muttering under their breath, they climbed out of the pool, grabbing their towels and belongings. The speaker emitted a loud crackle as someone hastily switched it off as they filed out through the side gate. Freddy caught Ethan muttering to one of his friends, "He's such a buzzkill." Freddy returned home from the grocery store to find Louis and a group of his friends lounging by the pool, beers in hand. They had brought a portable grill and were flipping burgers on Freddy's patio, as though it were a public park. The smell of sizzling meat, mixed with the scent of chlorine, created an almost surreal juxtaposition. Freddy approached the group, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Louis greeted him with the same disarming grin he had used during their first meeting. "Hey Freddy, hope you don't mind. We figured we'd keep the kids entertained while we watch the game." Freddy's voice was cold. "I do mind. Louis, I've told you before this is my property. You can't just come here whenever you feel like it." Louis's grin didn't falter, but there was an edge to his tone as he replied, "Relax. Man, we're just neighbors hanging out, no harm, no foul." Freddy took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "This isn't up for debate. You and your friends need to leave now." The tension was palpable as the group exchanged glances. Finally, Louis raised his hands, and mock surrendered. All right, we'll clear out. No need to make a scene." It took them nearly half an hour to pack up their things and leave, and when they were gone, Freddie was left with a yard littered with empty bottles, crumpled napkins, and the lingering smell of smoke. As he cleaned up the mess, a mix of anger and exhaustion settled over him. He couldn't keep living like this, constantly on edge, waiting for the next intrusion. Over the years, he had learned the basics of keeping a pool clean and safe, but now he dove deeper into the subject. He read article after article about water chemistry, chlorine levels, and pH balance, searching for a solution that was both harmless and dramatic enough to send a message. It wasn't long before he found exactly what he was looking for. Superchlorination was a common pool maintenance process that involved adding an elevated amount of chlorine to the water to kill bacteria and algae. When done properly, the water would be temporarily cloudy and uninviting, rendering the pool unusable for several days. To someone unfamiliar with pool care, it could look like a chemical disaster, harmless but intimidating. Freddie's plan was simple. He would create a scene that would deter the marshals from ever attempting to use his pool again. He even considered adding a harmless foaming agent to enhance the visual impact. The goal wasn't to scare anyone physically, but to create enough of a spectacle that no one would want to come near his property for a long time over the next few days. Freddie gathered the supplies he needed. He visited a pool supply store on the edge of town, where he purchased a bulk container of chlorine granules and a foaming agent often used in themed pool parties. He also bought a testing kit to ensure that his pool's water would return to normal after the stunt. Everything had to be done carefully and methodically. Freddie wasn't about to risk damaging the pool. He had worked so hard to maintain each evening after work. He fine-tuned his plan. He researched the exact proportions of chemicals needed to create the desired effect and ran small-scale tests in a bucket to ensure that the foam wouldn't damage the pool's surface. By Thursday night, he was confident that everything was ready. All that remained was to wait for the right moment. Freddie didn't have to wait long on Saturday afternoon as the sun reached its zenith. Freddie returned home from the grocery store to the now familiar sound of laughter and music coming from his backyard. He paused in his driveway, taking a deep breath as his hands tightened around the steering wheel. This time he wasn't angry or surprised. He was prepared. He parked his car, unloaded the groceries into the kitchen, and then retrieved the supplies he had carefully stored in the garage. With the small bucket of chlorine granules in one hand and the foam agent in the other, Freddie made his way toward the backyard, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and determination. When he reached the gate, he paused to take in the scene. The marshals were out in full force, along with at least a dozen other people. Louis stood by a portable grill flipping burgers, while Imogen handed out drinks. The twins and their friends were splashing in the pool, and someone had set up a speaker that blasted pop music loud enough to rattle the windows. Freddie opened the gate and stepped inside. No one noticed him at first, too caught up in their hurry to acknowledge his presence. He walked purposefully toward the pool, setting the bucket and foaming agent down at the water's edge. Finally, Louis noticed him. "Hey, Freddie," Louis called, raising his beer in a mock toast. "Glad you could join the party. Grab a drink and relax, man." Freddie ignored him. Without a word, he knelt by a pool and began scooping chlorine granules into the water. Almost immediately, a chemical reaction began. The water bubbled and churned, releasing small plumes of steam as the chlorine dissolved. A few people noticed and stopped what they were doing. Their laughter faded into confused murmurs. "What's he doing?" Imogen asked, her voice tinged with concern. Freddie stood reaching for the foaming agent. He poured it into the pool in a slow, deliberate stream, watching as the water began to froth. Thick white bubbles rose to the surface, spreading rapidly until the entire pool was covered in a layer of foam. The previously clear water turned a murky, uninviting gray, but now everyone was staring at the pool in stunned silence. The music from the speaker seemed oddly out of place against the backdrop of confusion and growing unease. Finally, Louis stepped forward, his expression a mixture of curiosity and irritation. "What the hell is this, Freddie?" he demanded. Freddie turned to face him, his expression calm but resolute. "Pool maintenance," he said simply. "The water is not safe for swimming right now. You should probably leave." Louis's jaw tightened, and for a moment it looked like he was going to argue, but the sight of the bubbling, foaming pool behind Freddie seemed to sap his confidence. He glanced back at his guests, many of whom were already gathering their belongings. and murmuring about heading home. Imogen placed a hand on Louis's arm. "Let's go," she said quietly. "We'll talk about this later." One by one, the guests trickled out of the yard, leaving behind only Louis. Imogen and their kids. Louis lingered for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he stared at Freddie. But in the end, he said nothing, with a final frustrated shaking his head. He turned and walked away, his family following close behind. When the yard was empty, Freddie let out a long breath, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in a day. He looked down at the foamy, clouded pool and smiled faintly. It wasn't the peaceful oasis he had envisioned when he bought the house, but for now, it would do. More importantly, it was his oasis, and he intended to keep it that way. As he began cleaning up the leftover supplies, Freddie couldn't help but wonder how the marshals would respond. He knew this wasn't the end of the conflict. It was only the beginning. But for the first time, he felt like he had the upper hand, and that was a good start. The aftermath of Freddie's bold move played out much as he had anticipated, though the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. The day after the incident, the marshal's backyard was unusually quiet. No loud laughter, no clinking of glasses. No teenager was bouncing basketballs on the driveway. It was as if the entire family had retreated into their house to regroup and process what had happened. Freddie, meanwhile, spent the day meticulously cleaning the pool. The foamy water and chemical imbalance had served their purpose, and now it was time to restore his oasis to its pristine condition. He tested the pH levels, adjusted the chlorine, and ran the filtration system until the water sparkled once more. The process was laborious, but for Freddie it was worth it. Each bucket of clean water he added to the pool felt like reclaiming a piece of his space. By mid-afternoon, the yard was back to the serene refuge it had been when he first moved in. Freddie sat on a lounge chair with a glass of iced tea and enjoyed the sound of birds chirping in the trees overhead. For the first time in weeks, his backyard felt like his own again. The peace lasted until Monday morning. Freddie was sipping his coffee and reading emails when he heard the doorbell ring. Setting his mug down, he walked to the door and opened it to find Louis standing on the porch. The man's posture was tense, his arms crossed over his chest and his jaw clenched. His usual jovial demeanor was gone, replaced by something colder and more calculating mourning. "Louis," Freddie said evenly, keeping his expression neutral. "We need to talk," Louis said, his tone curt. "About what you did to the pool." Freddie raised an eyebrow, leaning casually against the doorframe. "What did I do to my pool?" "You mean?" Louis's nostrils flared. "Don't play games with me, Freddie. That stunt you pulled ruined my weekend. Everyone who came over left thinking your pool's some kind of toxic hazard." Freddie fought the urge to smirk. "Well, Louis, if your weekend was ruined, maybe it's because you were trespassing on my property. I've told you before that the pool is off limits, but you didn't listen." Louis stepped closer, his voice lowering to a growl. "You didn't have to go that far. We're neighbors, for God's sake. This is supposed to be a community." Freddie's patience was wearing thin. He straightened, meeting Louis's gaze without flinching. Respecting someone's property is part of being in a community. "Louis, I've tried talking to you. I've asked politely, but you ignored every word I said. If you don't like the consequences, maybe you should think twice before walking into someone else's yard." Uninvited, Louis opened his mouth to respond, but stopped short, as though realizing he wasn't going to win this argument. He took a step back, shaking his head. "Fine. You've made your point, but don't expect anyone around here to take your side if you keep pulling stunts like that." Freddie gave a small, non-committal shrug. "I'm not looking for sides. Louis, I'm looking for peace. That's all I've ever wanted," without another word. Louis turned and walked back toward his house. Freddie watched him go, a mix of relief and weariness settling in his chest. The conversation had gone about as well as he'd expected. Louis was angry but not outright confrontational. Still, Freddie knew better than to assume the matter was resolved. Louis didn't strike him as someone who gave up easily. For the next few weeks, the marshals kept their distance. The twins no longer sneaked into the yard, and Louis's booming voice was noticeably absent from the neighborhood. It was almost as if they had finally taken Freddie's warnings to heart, but Freddie couldn't shake the feeling that this was a temporary reprieve, a pause, rather than a resolution. The rest of the neighborhood, however, seemed to notice the tension. Freddie received a few curious glances from other neighbors during his evening walks, and the Reuben, who lived across the street, even stopped him one afternoon to ask how things were going. "You've been awfully quiet over there," Mrs. Watson said, her tone friendly but probing. I hope everything's all right. Freddie smiled politely. He's just been busy with work. Things are fine. She gave him a knowing look as though she suspected there was more to the story, but decided not to press the issue. Well, if you ever need anything, you know where to find us. Freddie thanked her and continued his walk, feeling both grateful for the support and wary of the neighborhood gossip that might be brewing. He had no intention of dragging anyone else into the mess with the Marshalls. This was his problem to handle, and he would see it through alone. The tension reached its peak. 2 weeks later, Freddie was relaxing in his living room one evening when he heard a loud knock at the door. He opened it to find Imogen Marshall standing on his porch, her expression a mixture of frustration and apology. "Freddie, can we talk?" she asked, her voice softer than her husband's but no less urgent. Freddie stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. They sat at the dining table, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Imogen fidgeted with her hands, her eyes darting around the room as though searching for the right words. "Look," she finally said, "I know things have gotten tense between us, and I know Louis can be a bit much sometimes, but this whole situation is getting out of hand. The kids don't understand why they can't go swimming anymore, and Louis feels like you're singling us out." Freddie took a deep breath, keeping his tone measured. "Imogen, I'm not singling anyone out. I'm protecting my property. I've tried talking to Louis, but he doesn't listen. I've been more than patient, but enough is enough." Imogen nodded slowly, her expression softening. "I get it, really. I do, and I'll talk to Louis again. I hope we can move past this. We're neighbors after all." Freddie hesitated before replying, "I want that too, Imogen, but it has to start with boundaries. If Louis and the kids respect my space, there won't be any more problems." Imogen smiled faintly. "Fair enough. I'll do my best." After she left, Freddie sat alone at the table, his thoughts churning. He wanted to believe that things could improve, that the Marshalls would finally learn to respect his boundaries, but a small voice in the back of his mind warned him not to let his guard down. The conflict might be quieting down, but it wasn't over, not yet. The days following Imogen's visit were oddly peaceful. For the first time since the ordeal began, Freddie felt a sense of calm return to his home. The Marshalls seemed to be making an effort to respect his boundaries. The twins no longer loitered near the property line, and Louis's boisterous voice no longer echoed through the Casac. Even the loud weekend barbecues had ceased. It was as if the family had taken Freddie's warnings and actions to heart, or at least decided it wasn't worth the trouble to continue pushing. Freddie took the opportunity to fully reclaim his space. He spent a weekend tending to his backyard, restoring it to the haven he had envisioned when he first bought the house. The patio furniture was cleaned and rearranged, the lawn meticulously trimmed, and the pool returned to its crystal-clear perfection. Sitting by the water with a cold drink in hand, Freddie finally felt a sense of accomplishment. His backyard was his again, yet despite the outward peace, Freddie couldn't shake a lingering unease. The Marshalls were quiet, but the abrupt shift felt almost too good to be true. Louis didn't strike him as the type to back down so easily, and Freddie couldn't help but wonder if this calm was just the prelude to another storm. The neighborhood, meanwhile, seemed to take notice of the change. Freddie often caught his neighbors casting curious glances his way as he went about his daily routine. During a trip to the local grocery store, he ran into Mr. Watson, who greeted him with a warm smile, but quickly shifted the conversation toward recent events. "It's been pretty quiet on your end lately," Mr. Watson remarked, his tone light but probing. "Is everything all right with the Marshalls?" Freddie hesitated. "Unsure how much to reveal. Things are fine," he said carefully. "I think we've come to an understanding." "Good to hear, Mr. Watson replied, though the look in his eyes suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Louis can be a bit stubborn, but he's not a bad guy. Just take some time to figure out how to deal with him." Freddie forced a smile, nodding politely before changing the subject. He had no interest in fueling neighborhood gossip, but the conversation left him with a nagging sense that his feud with the Marshalls had become a topic of discussion among the residents. That evening, Freddie sat on his patio, staring at the pool as the sun dipped below the horizon. He thought about everything that had transpired over the past weeks, his initial excitement at moving into the neighborhood, the mounting frustration with the Marshalls, and the drastic measures he had taken to protect his space. While he didn't regret his actions, he couldn't ignore the toll the conflict had taken on him. What should have been a peaceful new chapter in his life had turned into a battle for boundaries, leaving him drained and wary as the weeks passed. The tension in the neighborhood began to ease. The Marshalls remained distant but cordial, offering a nod or a polite wave. When their paths crossed, Freddie continued his routine, enjoying the quiet and rebuilding his sense of normalcy. But the experience had changed him. He found himself more guarded and more cautious about interactions with his neighbors. The dream of a tranquil suburban life felt slightly tarnished, its edges dulled by the reality of navigating complex social dynamics. One Saturday morning, as Freddie sipped his coffee on the patio, he noticed something unusual. Louis was standing in his own backyard alone, his gaze fixed on the fence that separated their properties. After a moment, he approached the fence and cleared his throat, catching Freddie's attention. "Hey, Louis," he called, his voice lacking its usual bravado. "Got a minute?" Freddie hesitated before setting his coffee down and walking over to the fence. "What's up, Louis?" He rubbed the back of his neck, looking uncharacteristically sheepish. "Look, I just wanted to say maybe we got off on the wrong foot. I know we've been a pain, and I get why you were upset. I guess I didn't realize how much the pool meant to you." Freddie studied Louis's face, searching for any hint of insincerity. To his surprise, the man seemed genuine. His usual cocky grin was replaced by a tentative expression, one that spoke of an effort to make amends. "I appreciate you saying that," Freddie replied carefully. "I've just worked hard for this place, and I needed you to understand that." Louis nodded. "I get it, I do. And I'll make sure the kids know to stay out of your yard from now on. No more uninvited pool parties." "I promise." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the tension between them finally starting to dissolve. While Freddie wasn't ready to fully trust Louis, he could sense that this was a step in the right direction. "Thanks," Freddie said finally. "That means a lot." Louis offered a small smile before turning and heading back to his house. Freddie watched him go, feeling a cautious sense of relief. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start over the next few days. Freddie noticed subtle changes in the Marshalls' behavior. The twins greeted him with polite HS when they saw him, and Imogen waved from her car as she pulled out of the driveway. Louis even stopped by one afternoon with a 6-pack of beer as a peace offering. While they weren't exactly friends, the animosity that had once defined their relationship was slowly being replaced by mutual respect. Freddie allowed himself to hope that the worst was finally behind him. The quiet that had eluded him for so long now felt real, and for the first time since moving in, he began to truly feel at home. A month had passed since Freddie and Louis's tentative truce. The neighborhood had returned to its usual rhythm, with families chatting over fences, children riding bikes on the quiet streets, and weekend barbecues filling the air with the scent of grilled food. Freddie found himself relaxing into the life he had envisioned when he first moved in. The Marshalls had kept their word. No more uninvited guests in his yard, no more late-night parties echoing through the cul-de-sac. The peace felt earned, and Freddie cherished it. But there was a nagging thought that Freddie couldn't quite shake while the conflict with the Marshalls had subsided. The distance between him and his neighbors lingered. He didn't want to be seen as the recluse, or, worse, the troublemaker. The idea of bridging that gap had been brewing in his mind for weeks, and after much consideration, he decided on a solution. A neighborhood baru. Freddie's decision was pragmatic as much as it was social. Hosting a gathering on his own terms would allow him to set clear boundaries while showing his neighbors that he was open to community and connection. It was a way to mend fences, figuratively speaking, and perhaps even build some goodwill in the process. The Saturday before the event, Freddie spent the day preparing. He scrubbed the patio, cleaned the grill, and carefully planned a menu that balanced simplicity with flavor. Burgers, hot dogs, grilled vegetables, and a few side dishes. He even made a batch of his mother's famous potato salad, a family recipe that had been a hit at every gathering he could remember. Freddie personally delivered invitations to the neighbors on his street. Keeping the tone light and welcoming, he invited the Reuben, the young couple next door, and a few others he had spoken to in passing. When he reached the Marshalls' house, he hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door. Imogen answered, her expression wary but polite. "Hey, Imogen," Freddie said with a smile. "I'm hosting a barbecue tomorrow afternoon, and I'd like you and your family to come. It's a chance to reset, you know." Imogen blinked, clearly surprised, before returning the smile. "That sounds nice, thanks." "Freddie, I'll let Louis know." The next day the weather was perfect. Sunny with a gentle breeze, Freddie had set up tables with plenty of seating, laid out a spread of food, and even filled a cooler with ice-cold drinks. As the guests arrived, Freddie greeted each of them warmly, making small talk and introducing himself to those he hadn't met before. The Reuben were the first to arrive, followed by the couple with the baby, and then, to Freddie's surprise, the Marshalls. Louis looked hesitant as he approached Freddie with a bottle of wine in one hand. "Thanks for the invite," he said, his tone unusually subdued. "Didn't think you'd want us here after everything." Freddie waved off the comment. "It's water under the bridge, Louis. Today is about starting fresh." Louis nodded his shoulders, relaxing slightly. Imogen and the kids followed close behind, each offering polite greetings. Freddie noticed the twins looking around the backyard, their expressions a mix of nostalgia and restrained, as though they weren't quite sure how to behave now that the pool was off limits. Freddie smiled inwardly, appreciating their newfound respect for his space. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere became increasingly lively. The smell of grilled food wafted through the air as neighbors chatted and laughed, their voices mingling with the soft tea of music playing from Freddie's portable speaker. The Marshalls, to Freddie's surprise, blended seamlessly into the group. Louis shared stories about his days as a college athlete. Imogen chatted with the Reuben about gardening, and the twins helped a group of kids set up a game of cornhole. Freddie turned to face him, surprised by the sincerity in Louis's tone. "I appreciate that," Freddie said, "and I'm glad we've moved past it. I just hope we can keep things respectful from here on out." Louis nodded, his expression earnest. "We will, I promise." For the first time since their conflict began, Freddie felt a genuine sense of understanding between them. It wasn't friendship, not yet anyway, but it was a start as the last of the guests left and the yard felt quiet. Freddie stood by the pool watching the moonlight dance on its surface. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not just from the success of the barbecue, but from the realization that he had taken control of his life and his space. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had taught him the value of standing up for himself and the importance of setting boundaries. For the first time in months, Freddie felt truly at peace. The neighborhood seemed to notice the change as well during his evening walks. Freddie was met with warm smiles and friendly greetings from people who had previously avoided eye contact. It was from Louis inviting him to a small barbecue the Marshalls were hosting that weekend. Freddie hesitated, the memories of their earlier conflicts flashing through his mind. But as he looked at the note, he realized that this was a chance to close the chapter on their rocky start and truly move forward. On the day of the barbecue, Freddie arrived with a bottle of wine in hand, and Louis greeted him at the door. His usual bravado was tempered with a genuine warmth that Freddie hadn't seen before. The gathering was smaller and quieter than the chaotic pool parties of the past, and Freddie found himself enjoying the easy camaraderie that had taken root as the sun set and the guests began to leave. Freddie lingered for a moment chatting with Imogen and Louis by the grill. They talked about everything from gardening tips to local news, their conversation free of the tension that had once defined their relationship. For the first time, Freddie felt like he was part of the community, not just an outsider looking in. That night, as he walked back to his house, the battles of the past were behind him, and the future stretched out before him like the calm, Andine waters of his pool. For the first time in a long time, Freddie felt truly at home. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more great stories like this one. Share this video with your friends and family, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Stay tuned for our next video and check out others you might have missed. See you next time.